on YouTube. So thank you, everyone. So welcome to Monday Monologues. I'm Susan Gent. I work at both the Iowa State University and the Ames Public Libraries. And this is our last virtual Monday Monologues of the semester, but we will be live on campus on the south steps of Parks Library next Monday. Iowa State Theater will be sharing songs with us. So please, if you're on campus, stop by. We had a great time last week. I want to make sure that I share the Iowa State University Library resources related to today's topics. I will also go ahead and post these in the description on YouTube if you need to find them again. They're also at the First Amendment Days website. We have a library guide with a lot of different related resources that Charles Year, librarian at University Library, created. And then we also have a Iowa State University Special Collections has digitized some of the photos from the Vietnam War protests on campus. And then they've also got some audio archives. So check those out, they're very interesting. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We will be watching the chat in YouTube, although it does move pretty quickly. So our goal is to pass some questions or comments on to Julie at the end so that she can ask our presenters. We're looking forward to seeing how the time works, and we'll be flexible on that end. And also please note that today's performance may contain adult language and themes, and we're an adult audience, so I think that'll be okay. I'm really excited to have Monday Monologues be kicking off this year's First Amendment Week series. Julie, Rosa, and I have been talking and collaborating in different ways for a while, but I've always admired the breadth and depth of this week-long celebration. And if you check out how much is going on, it's really amazing and quite a celebration, especially after having to cancel last year. Julie Rosa is an adjunct assistant professor and the First Amendment specialist in the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication. She chairs the First Amendment Committee, which develops this annual First Amendment Day celebrations, which has been a nationally recognized event since 2002. Julie serves as a resource on legal issues related to freedom of speech and press. She also provides outreach and training on First Amendment topics to the campus and the community. So I'll let Julie introduce the rest of the program. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Spencer and Parks Library. On behalf of the First Amendment Committee, we are thrilled to collaborate with today's Monday Monologues. In a moment, you will hear firsthand the power of protest from two members of the ISU family who lived it firsthand. One in the summer of 2020 during the Black Lives Matter marches, the other in 1970 and 71 during the Vietnam protests. I can think of no better way to kick off our 19th annual First Amendment Days at Iowa State University than working with Parks Library, which is a partner and a friend in advancing and supporting free expression. So thank you. For 19 years, Iowa State has been celebrating the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment: speech, press, petition, assembly, and religion. Oftentimes, these 5 freedoms are taken for granted, sometimes even vilified. So we work hard to shift the focus to educating and celebrating the value of free expression. At the same time, we acknowledge the burden and the responsibility that comes with any freedom. Today, we put the focus on the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. This focus fits beautifully with our theme this year, Some Assembly Required. We hope you'll check our website at greenlee.iastate.edu for our week's worth of events. It is jam-packed, as Susan mentioned, and we hope you can join us for as many activities as possible. Today, you will hear from 2 individuals who lived this notion of assembling, of petitioning, of speaking, and of acting. First, you'll hear from Julian Neely, who will share his account as a contributing member among many phenomenal leaders who organized the Ames Black Lives Matter movement marches for justice in the summer of 2020 on the ISU campus. Julian is a former Iowa State Student Government president in 2018 and 19, and is currently a graduate student in the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, and we are fortunate to have him. Second, you will hear from Jerry Schnorr. Jerry is also a former ISU Government of Student Body president. He served from 1970 to 1971. During his tenure, Jerry helped lead a strike by the student government and protests against the Vietnam War and the Kent State shootings in May of 1970. Jerry is the current director of the Center for Global and Regional Environmental Research at the University of Iowa, and we are thrilled to have you here as well, Jerry. Julian and Jerry will share their experiences for about 10 minutes, maybe a little more, and then we may have time for questions at the end, so please feel free to add your questions to the chat on the YouTube live stream. Julian and Jerry, we thank you both so much for sharing your time and experiences with us today to help demonstrate the power of peaceful protest. And with that, Julian, let's hear from you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to tell my story and some of my experiences from this past summer. I will first start off by mentioning that with protesting, assembling, and even like organizing rallies and different marches and things like that, this notion, as Julie kind of talked about, of it being vilified. And so in history, we have seen how marches can be, they could face different hardships. And a lot of the marches that face a lot of hardships and challenges by specifically law enforcement have been like these marches have been organized by people of color, younger people, as well as by individuals that are identified as being a woman or non-binary. And so with that, I want to say that when we look at the Black Lives Matter marches this past summer, all of them have been non-violent. And so it is taking to the streets, marching down either Lincoln Way, you could say Grand Avenue in Des Moines, Court Ave, or what have you, and being able to share a message and to show and display you can say chants, messages, or have you, to share with the community about the importance of what has been going on. A lot of the things that sparked the marches this past summer were because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and so many more. And so seeing these visuals, and that's another thing with social media, we're able to physically see the video on our phone of all these different situations that have gone down between citizens and law enforcement. As everyone knows, this trial is currently going on right now with Derek, the officer that murdered George Floyd, and how much stress and how much fear and sadness is involved in that. But from the start, so if we first talk about Des Moines, I'm going to share some photos and some video of what occurred. And these photos and videos show young people that are marching, that are engaging, that are sharing their voice, that are saying that I don't want to be unheard anymore, sharing their emotions, sharing their sadness, sharing their anger about these continuous situations that are occurring within our society. And so some of these photos are, I don't want to say graphic, but definitely triggering. So be cautious. So this first one is of this child. This child was a part of one of the marches. He was riding his bike. He was, his other friend was also riding their bike through these marches and protests, and they were like bystanders in a way. And law enforcement were just throwing tear gas, tear gas canisters, pepper spray, and these kids were connected with it. And so one thing that I learned from this experience is that law enforcement in these situations do not care who is being hit. I know in my own situation, when we were at the Capitol, I remember them shooting tear gas canisters just anywhere. So here's a video where they just shot tear gas and people were running away. Here's another one where people were driving through. And people were getting hit with tear gas canisters, and they were not caring. So you can see there the shooting didn't care. So in this situation, there were many community leaders out there. There were many other organizational leaders out there that were just observing and making sure these young people were safe, but they were still getting tear gas. They were still getting pepper sprayed. They were still being attacked by law enforcement. And so a lot of times in these situations, from what I observed and also experienced, it was that law enforcement was the antagonizer. Law enforcement was making it a peaceful, making the situation that was a peaceful or nonviolent protest into something that was extremely brutalizing and violent. And so that is something too, is that certain people are allocated the right of this First Amendment of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and others are not. And typically what we've seen through history is it's Black people that aren't able, Black and brown people that don't have the right to use freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. We also see it with those that identify as LGBTQIA+. We also see it with folks that are younger challenging these systems that typically need to be challenged and modified or even eliminated from our system of justice or just how we operate as a country. But oftentimes this violence that these protesters endure is a way to be able to mute and also to mute them in the things that they're sharing with the society. And so a lot of these situations have gone left because of the response of law enforcement not allowing people to be able to vocalize their expressions, law enforcement not allowing people to share their anguish, and etc. And so we've seen this specifically in Des Moines. And then there's also now, if you look at legislation within our own state capital, there's legislation that is now empowering law enforcement to do these acts and also empowering folks that may oppose your opinion to engage in these acts of violence against these protesters. And so we have to be mindful of not only of just this societal and individual like understandings of protest, but also understand how policies and legislation is also going to impact how people are able to voice themselves. We see this not only within like local governments, state governments, or federal governments. We also see this with private institutions. I remember when I was at Syracuse, if people know the Not Again SU movement, there were students that were literally locked within the administration stairwell because administration did not want to speak with these students. And so, this is something, these are ways that people are muted. These are ways that people are experiencing being unheard and voiceless. But we have to allow people to have the right of this freedom of speech and also take advantage of this freedom of speech. And with our country and this historical context, not everybody gets that right, and that needs to change. Oh, Julie.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was just hanging on your every word and I was waiting for the next breath. Let's do this, Julian. We will come back and hear more of your story after we hear from Jerry. And I think it'll be really interesting to compare the two experiences and your two perspectives. So Jerry, we'd like to hear from you.
Thanks, Julie. I'd like to tell about the events of May 1970 at Iowa State. It really went back to the beginnings of the war in Vietnam, and gradually students got more and more active in the anti-war movement. Beginning also in October of 1969 with the October moratorium, we had perhaps 2,000 Iowa State students march down Lincoln Way, all in a peaceful protest. But in April of 1970, on April 30th, President Nixon widened the war and moved troops into Cambodia. And people saw this, especially students, saw this as a big expansion of the war that they were vehemently opposed to. A series of rallies and protests began after that April 30th incursion into Cambodia, but made much worse by on May 4th, when 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard at Kent State University. Immediately after that, the government of the student body, believe it or not, decided to have a vote on a student strike. I myself was just for marshaling our leadership to make a peaceful rally, but in the end, the student senators decided a strike was called for, and that meant no participation in classes anymore, striking Iowa State, and the vote was 15-11, fairly close, but that's what took place as a result of the anguish and anger of what happened on May 4th at Kent State. Of course, students were very involved, extremely involved, because there was mandatory conscription at that point, the draft. And if you should lose your student deferment, for example, you were subject to being drafted and going to Vietnam, where the war was very serious at the time, and many were dying. Women were not conscripted at that time, only men, but the protests had many females, almost half, I would say, as well. Well, the next day after that GSB meeting, at noon, a rally was called, and it was to be a march down Lincoln Way in solidarity. And Susan Gent, maybe you could show a picture of how many students were at that rally on May 5th. This is from the library archives at Iowa State. At the time we had, I think, about 19,000 students, and you can see there's something like 3,000, more than 3,000 students here between Beardshire and Curtis on that next day, May 6th, it would have been, and it was completely peaceful. There was ROTC on campus, and the Armory was a focal point, which I worried about as GSB president could become violent, but it did not. About 50 students ended up occupying the Armory. The administration could have had them arrested because the building was normally closed in the evening, but they chose not to. After that rally, you saw on Central Campus, some went over and they did not touch or hurt, but they interfered with the ROTC drills on the field north of Beyer Hall. Once again, everyone showed restraint, and the ROTC drill stopped, and everyone went back down to Lincoln Way for the march. The idea was to go to the Selective Service Draft Board. About 2,000 students ended up doing that, marching all the way down Lincoln Way to downtown Ames, where the draft board, the Selective Service, was. At that time, it was again, we had a jug band, and we had much singing and participation, which seemed to ease the tension. However, a group of students, maybe 8 or 10, occupied the front of the draft board office, which had been closed. It went down some steps, and it was locked, so they couldn't get into the draft board office. But picture thousands, well, at least 1,000 people out in the street, and then a few went down in. That did result in arrests the next morning. Tear gas was used. They were forcibly removed. And the government student body kind of organized a fund to raise bail money for the students who were arrested, and very successfully then the next, that afternoon, they were bailed out. The bail money, about $6,000 was raised at that time immediately in one day, and the students were bailed out. But again, it was pretty much nonviolent on the part of the students. The only violence which did occur in the ensuing days was a little bit the next week, when it was decided to stop the bus that was going with the conscriptees, the drafted people, down to Des Moines for their physicals. And students ended up sitting in front and in back of the bus in downtown Ames. And they were arrested, and one person resisted arrest, and there was some violence at that time. It was the week of Visha as well. So we had no classes on I think it was the 7th and 8th of May because of Visha, and the protesters were allowed to participate in Visha, both with a couple floats and then a march afterwards. So there was a lot of collaboration and cooperation actually on campus. The faculty council voted to, in some sympathy with the student strike resolution, to allow students to take if they felt the need to, that they could not continue classes under these conditions, that they would take their grade from May 6th and continue to work to persuade people against the Vietnam War. We formed actually a vital issue center in which people began to go out and talk about what had happened. I can tell you that the public was very polarized at that time too, maybe as much as right now in our history. And we did not receive a good reception with people in general. There was the so-called silent majority of people who were against what was going on. But I think the protests in those days, and because they were so peaceful, the faculty worked with the students. More than half of the students did take their grades from May 6th and went about doing other things. Some in our Vital Issue Center and going out and explaining what was going on to people. And I do think some minds eventually began to be changed. My own parents, and my wife's parents, were both very much against the Vietnam War, but through these protests and through time, and also watching the war for the first time on their televisions, the sentiment gradually changed. So from May 1970 until January of 73, that's when the war finally ended. But I'd like to think that it began to end with those protests in 1970. There was some violence later on. I tried to find out, many of us, what happened, but the city hall was bombed. The jail was in the basement of the city hall at the time in Ames. We never did figure out who did it. I don't think it was students, but I really don't know. But I would say that I believe that some minds were changed. The campus culture was certainly changed. Governor Ray invited campus leaders, myself included, to Des Moines on that Thursday before Visha, and he came to campus the next Saturday, and we picked him up at the Ames airport and spent several hours with a lot of students out at the Towers Residence Hall, and he assured us that if we maintained the nonviolence and the peacefulness, that he would not send in the National Guard. And that was very comforting. And again, I think I'm not sure it could happen today, but things were very polarized, just like they are today. I remember thinking that maybe there's going to have to be some kind of a civil war over this. I admit I was completely naive, a 20-year-old kid, but I didn't know how it was all going to end. In the end, finally, the war was ended 2.5 years later. I do think some minds were changed, and it does go to show you the power of peaceful, nonviolent protest. Thanks very much, Julie, for the chance to share.
Thank you. Thank you to both Julian and Jerry. We do have time for a couple of questions, and your stories are so powerful in helping us to understand the environment that exists when we do raise our voice and gather and assemble and petition the government for redress. I think you both emphasized the fact that the right in the First Amendment is the right to peaceably assemble. It doesn't say, you know, that assembly must be quiet or silent by any means. As a matter of fact, in order to petition, we need to make our demands known. I think that is so important. So with that being said, though, talk to us, Julian, if you will, first about your perspective in how we can better understand and embrace the importance of supporting this idea of protest and assembly.
I believe the impact of protests are, we've seen them work. Even this past summer, when we were able to get those that had felonies or completed their convictions of having a felony, being able to restore their right to vote during the November election, that was a great success. We were able to get, I think it was approximately like 40 to 50,000 individuals throughout the state of Iowa the right to vote right before the November election occurred. And so that was extremely impactful. I think too is that when we look at, I think the second thing is that when we look at protests, and especially when we look at Black leaders, oftentimes these Black leaders are immediately criminalized. And so that also impacts the success, also impacts the duration of protests and these movements and things like that. Like I know members that I worked with that organize these that I worked with to organize these protests, they were immediately labeled as domestic terrorists by Des Moines Police Department. And so that type of label also, like, they have, since law enforcement has their own community, they have their own families, that message gets shared from people to people. It's literally like telephone. And so that's something you cannot control. And so when you have this narrative that you're fighting, and then you have people that are investigating you, even though they don't have a case, you're being surveillanced. I remember multiple different accounts where we had law enforcement like patrol the area that we were at, either where we were meeting or where we were congregating. I remember when we had this donation concert, I forgot the real name of it, but we had it at Woolies, and I remember seeing multiple undercover cops in their disguised vehicles watching us, taking photos and videos of us while we were leaving and entering this venue. And later on, we find out like they have these photographs, like it got linked on, it got exposed on I think social media or something like that. But like they literally were taking photos of people and trying to incriminate them. And so like the things that we hear about like Black Panthers, we hear about like the things that Dr. King went through, Malcolm X went through, Angela Davis, and all these other like major Black leaders, the different things that they went through, we were living it. Like we were living like the initial like process of the police trying to dismantle a movement. And so it kind of validated the stories that we were hearing, and and it really just really put into perspective of like how difficult it is to challenge the system and how embedded the system is and how like protected it is. And it really makes you think that you need more people on board. You need to educate more people. You need to share this knowledge to more people so they can begin to unlearn and then also learn what is actually occurring in our society, to be able to get a larger assembly, to be able to challenge and hopefully correct the way that our society is operating. Because if we don't, we're going to be reliving this cycle continuously.
Thank you. Julian, we can hear the passion in your voice and it's very inspiring. Jerry, from your perspective in the 70s, talk to us a little bit more about the notion of the importance of gathering together. You mentioned 19,000 students at one point. How did that come about?
Well, the 19,000 was the total student body, but there were about 3,000 or 4,000 on Central Campus in the picture that we saw earlier. And that came about, I think, because of the intense vested interest that we had in being against the Vietnam War and not wanting to be conscripted against our will to fight a war that we didn't believe in. So it was very personal. But I enjoyed so much Julian's remarks. And one thing I thought I'd mention is that it seems to me the response of the police was different, at least in Ames. Maybe it was different elsewhere at that time in 1970. But, you know, the police are so armored now. They have so many tear gas and weapons and mace and various things, and even armored vehicles purchased cheaply after the Afghan and Iraq wars. We used GSB marshals in white armbands, and the police allowed us to marshal the parade, the march of 2,000 people down to the draft board with no events. The police cooperated. They kept the traffic from, running into the students. And for the most part, I would say the city attorney at the time was quite against us and negative. But for the most part, there was very good cooperation. People were only tear gassed and arrested when they blocked the draft board office and when they blocked the bus and things like that. But it was very measured. And for the most part, I felt good support, even up to the governor, as I mentioned. I think that has changed. I think Julian, I'd be interested in your opinion, but the way that police approached the protests, and remember the citizens that they enforced the law for were very much against all this marching and everything at the time. But we had in Ames anyway, good cooperation. And I feel like that's a difference.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. We saw a lot of violence from police in Des Moines. Ames PD, ISU PD was a lot more willing to block off the roads without us asking, and to make sure that our safety was ensured. And so I will mention that. But with Des Moines PD, it was like they were wanting to harm us. And I remember one night we went near, I think we were marching down like Grand near the Capitol, and every turn we took, there was like a group of police marching with their vans, with their different trucks. And then we were like, okay, we gotta go a different way. And then again, we go down the street and then they're blocking us. And we were literally circled. And we got to this area where this bridge was, like near the museum, kind of like, it was like a couple of streets, a couple of blocks from the museum. And I remember us being circled and like literally having no place to go. And there was so much, people were so scared that people started like running. And so our circle broke. And so then they started like tear gassing, pepper spraying people. They were not in the mood to have conversation. We heard people, they're like, we don't want to talk. We're like literally here just to arrest students, or not arrest students, but arrest people. And so I remember people, after we were able to work with the Des Moines Mutual Aid, which was a fund to be able to bail people out during the summer, once we were able to bail them out, we could see all the scars and bruises on them following this. And so it was definitely just heartbreaking to see that, like, there was no conversation. It was like, you have the police were enforcing their way, and if you weren't following their direction, they weren't there to protect you. They were there to harm you. And so I will definitely state that, like, yeah, Des Moines PD was a group that was not willing to have a discussion or even like recognize the harm that they were doing.
Thank you. So one question that we have, and Jerry, you mentioned this a while ago when you said you thought minds were changed from some of the activities of the early 70s. Julian, let's start with you. Do you think that these protests are as impactful as they once were, or maybe even more so?
I would say yes, I believe they are. And something I've told a lot of community leaders since just speaking with them is that you have to tackle this oppression and these racist systems, these sexist systems, Islamophobic systems, homophobic systems, in multiple different ways. Like, one thing I've mentioned is that so far since our time, we haven't seen one way being granted the only way to work. Like, there's so many things, like, people have tried protesting, people have tried petitioning, people have tried working their way into that system to be able to internally fix it. People have tried to fix it externally. And we still are faced with the same situation, these same issues. People are still being harmed, people are still being brutalized, people are still being discriminated against. This is still happening. And so until we were able to identify what singular way worked, we have to be able to tap all resources and all angles to be able to tackle this issue. So let's keep protesting, let's keep taking the streets, let's keep rallying, let's keep working on policies and getting people elected that are providing a space for the voiceless. Let's keep hiring people that are there to fix all these cancerous policies and practices within these corporations or what have you. We have to tackle it from all different angles and work in a way that benefits one another, because until we can't stop until we actually see actual change. And oftentimes what we have seen, not only at our beloved institution, but in other spaces, is that we will put a Band-Aid over it, or we'll use something to be able to mute people as, like, you can be satisfied with us doing this. We've seen it similar to, as we explore, like, the Cat Hall situation, the September 29th movement, with us getting, with them being able to get the stadium named after Jack Trice, but they weren't able to change the name of Cat Hall. And so, like, we see these politics throughout our world, and those no longer are acceptable.
Jerry, share your thoughts, if you would, about sort of the effectiveness of this right to protest back from your perspective, and if you think more so today or less.
I think minds were also changed in the Black Lives Matter movement, can hopefully continue to be changed. Some polling indicates that there's some slip back of public opinion against the BLM movement, but definitely last summer, minds and hearts were changed to see that the police brutality cannot continue against Black and colored people. The power of protest back then, I think, had to do with changing the minds of the so-called silent majority to encourage even a Republican president to get out of the war. And it was started by Democratic presidents, but it was a Republican in the end who got us out of the war. And I think that's because of the protests and the other things that I mentioned. In fact, historians have backed that up. We've had 50 years of experience, so the historians can talk a lot about what went on during the Vietnam War, but we haven't had 50 years of experience yet. The newspapers are the first version of history that are written, and it remains to be seen, I would say. But my heart goes out to Julian, and I'm an active supporter of the Black Lives Matter, and I hope that we can continue to make progress on these issues as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know we have more questions, but we're going to be mindful of your time. I want to say thank you to you both for sharing your stories. You have changed minds, and having your first hand perspective just makes all of the difference. So thank you so much. I do want to say as well that there is an event tonight, 5:30 on our YouTube live stream for our First Amendment Days that is titled The First Amendment and the Civil Rights Movement. So just as Julian mentioned about sort of living this stuff today, we're going to hear the perspective of how the First Amendment worked with that movement. So please join us on YouTube at 5:30 if you are able. And let me see if there are any closing comments from our two guests.
Yes, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak about the experiences from the summer. I do want to mention, Jimmy, the more appropriate term would be people of color, not colored people. Just wanted to share that to the space.
Thank you, Julian. I got tongue-tied, but I was trying to say POC, people of color.
Understood. But I do want to say, people, please get involved. There are multiple organizations, not only in Ames, but in Central Iowa, that are working to be able to dismantle these racist and sexist systems that continuously oppress groups of people. So please get involved. Please donate if you can. Please get active, because until we get people active and knowledgeable about what is going on in our society, we'll continuously be in this cycle. We recently just saw yesterday another young Black man being murdered by police in Minnesota, literally during the same time the officer who killed George Floyd is being on trial. So these things are reoccurring, and we need to be able to recognize this and be able to fight it and be able to fix it, or else we're continuously going to see this in the news and get reports of people losing their lives due to law enforcement's brutality.
Well, thank you all for being here. This is Susan Gent. I'm just going to close us out. Check out all the wonderful programming that's ahead this week. Please feel free to visit the University Library's archives and the library guide that Charles Year created to support this programming. And hope we can see some people in person on campus as vaccinations come along and people are enjoying the spring weather. So I want to thank everybody for being a